Hello everyone and welcome to my tier list for Wild Rift patch 6.0b. We've had two balanced patches since the start of the new season and also the start of the patch 6.0 cycle, and actually we got these two patches back to back, one after 1 week and one after 2 weeks. So now in week 3 of the new season and week 3 of the new patch, and we're not going to be getting any patch this week. So I thought now is a good time to recap what's been changed in the meta, recap some of the changes that have happened to the tier list, and also talk to you guys what I think how the meta is shaping up at the moment and where we're looking at in the future for Wild Rift. As you can see, some champions have moved already just by looking at this screen itself. There are going to be some changes up and down. Some champions have just not changed at all with some of the nerfs that happened, but let's head straight into it anyway. First up in the Baron lane, the big change that happened in the Baron lane over the past few weeks was the nerf to Camille. Nerfing the second ability, the target's maximum health damage on the second ability was a pretty big hit. Overall, Camille has never really been a champion that does a lot of damage. She's really there for her teamfight presence, for how well she is at split pushing as well, and her lockdown with her ultimate. Them nerfing her damage over and over again, it definitely just keeps hurting her time and time again, and she's still a good champion to play, don't get me wrong, that's why she's in the S tier, but she's definitely not as strong as some of the other champions. Now, what I did was I moved Camille down into S tier, and I had all these champions in S tier, and I had no one in the S plus tier. But I thought to myself, it's like, there are some champions in this that are just way too powerful. And that's when I came up with these three champions, Jax, Wukong, and Ornn, all for different reasons. Jax in general has a great kit and can be flexible with his build, whether you want to go for AD Jax, AP Jax, Tank Jax as well. There are so many different items, and Jax can be played pretty flexibly. He's very safe in the early game. He never really dies since you can jump back to your tower. You can jump forward if you want to for ganks. But also he scales probably the best out of any Baron lane champion. He does a crazy amount of damage. He's super tanky, and he's a very strong champion to play. Wukong, probably one of the biggest lane bullies really in the game right now in the Baron lane. His first ability on top of Grasping Undying does a crazy amount of damage. And Wukong, of course, is very good in team fights. So you can dominate the laning phase, stack up Grasping Undying, get all these really big bruiser items, join team fights, use your ultimate, and be a team fight beast. So overall, Wukong is very, very powerful. And Ornn, in my opinion, the best tank out there at the moment. I would say a very close second to champions like Dr. Mundo and Shen, but they're a bit more situational. Ornn is pretty much all round a very good tank. Doesn't really matter what your matchup is. You don't really lose a lot of matchups at all. You're never going to win really any matchups as a tank if you're against some bruisers, but overall, you're still going to be very powerful. You can build tank. There's so many very strong tank items that you can build at the moment in the current meta, so that's why Ornn is sticking up into S plus tier. So S tier, as I mentioned, Camille has moved down. If I look over to this screen, I've got my notes on this screen so I don't forget what I've done. Riven, of course, with the buff, they nerfed the jungle Riven, but jungle Riven is still fine. It's still very, very strong to play. The buff to Baron lane Riven was actually very, very nice, especially the damage on the first ability. The problem is that Riven doesn't really do too much really in the Baron lane. I mean, you're very strong at the first few levels because you have your passive, you have your extra auto attacks, and you have so much mobility to your disposal. But once all these other champions get so many other abilities, then she becomes a bit weaker. She doesn't really have the damage to be able to kill. She doesn't have the same sort of team fight presence as some of these other champions. Her split pushing is not really that great as well. So yes, they buffed Riven in the Baron lane, and yes, she is stronger than what she was before, but I still feel like there is a way in which Riven can still underperform in most matchups in the Baron lane. Again, still, if you want to pick her up in the jungle, she's still going to be very, very strong there. And Fiora as well. Fiora, I've moved up from A tier to S tier. I think overall, Fiora is just a very good blind pick. You can win pretty much most matchups with Fiora. She's a very good blind pick. She's very mobile. She does a lot of damage as well, especially with her vitals in the early game and even in team fights as well. If you can parry one of the enemy's abilities, if you can get a really clutch stun off, then you could be really big in team fights. She doesn't do as much damage as what she did before, but in my opinion, one of the strongest blind picks right now. And also, she's very good against tanks. You build items like Eclipse at the moment, which deals more damage to tanks, or even Blades of the Ruin King, and it's a really good matchup against most of these tanks like Mundo, Shen, Malphite, Maokai, and even Ornn. In terms of the rest of the S tier, nothing else to say. Rumble did actually receive a buff as well. I thought Rumble was S tier anyway, so it doesn't actually move for me at all. If they buffed Rumble's damage, then Rumble might have been S plus tier. I still think Rumble is a very, very strong champion. You can play Rumble Baron Lane, you can play jungle if you want to. I actually played with the rank 1 Rumble player in EU who was playing First Strike Rumble Jungle, which actually seemed to work out pretty well, so I might have to give it a try. But yeah, overall, Rumble buff was very, very nice. Makes Rumble much tankier with the second ability. Again, the champion was good in the first place. In my opinion, didn't need to receive a buff, but a buff definitely helps him out. So that is Rumble in the S tier. And then moving down onto A tier, I believe now. Yes, moving on down into A tier. Mordekaiser has moved down to A tier. I think Mordekaiser is kind of a bit of an ulti bot at the moment. That's all you really pick Mordekaiser for. If you have a chance that you can use your ultimate, take a champion out of the fight. But the problem is sometimes Mordekaiser doesn't even win them 1v1s unless you're ulting like a support or maybe an AD carry that's not very fed. Other than that, when it comes to team fights and when it comes to the presence that Mordekaiser brings, he's kind of on the weak side compared to other AP champions. You know, you think of other AP champions, think of Rumble, Singed is still very strong. Jax, of course, is an AP champion as well. And Mordekaiser, in my opinion, is one of the lower end AP champions right now in the current meta. Other champions in A tier, Akali I'll talk about a little bit more in the mid lane, but in general, the Akali buff didn't really do too much at all. There are some other champions up here, champions here as well. Kayle did receive, for some reason, received a nerf. I have no idea why Kayle received a nerf, but in my opinion, she wasn't very strong in the first place in Baron Lane. Yes, she has a bit more survivability because of the durability patch, but she's very punishable still. And yeah, she doesn't move for me. For some reason, she was like really high in win rate. That's why she received a nerf, because I think it's to do with the Chinese win rates. But you have to remember what they do in China a lot is they trio queue a lot with champions like Kayle and Neela. They pair 2 enchanter supports and then they just give all the farm to Kayle. They just funnel the farm, and that's why they have such high win rates. So they're trying to nerf that side of things, but I don't think it's going to do too much. I still think Kayle and Neela is going to have a very high win rate, even though these champions are not very good in a solo queue scenario. Not really much to talk else in the A tier. And then B tier as well has pretty much stayed the same. Nothing else has stayed there. Nothing has changed in the B tier. Urgot did receive a bit of a buff as well. I'm just checking my notes. Urgot did receive the buff to his passive. Again, doesn't really do too much. Just makes his early game a bit stronger. But again, I feel like they're just other champions overall. But pretty happy with the Baron lane. I think overall there's a lot of S tier champions that you can pick up and perform on. Warwick is still very strong. Darius is still very strong as well. A tier champions, of course, can obviously still work. And B tier champions are just not that great. Moving into the jungle. Guess what? The nerfs to Amumu and Mbessa did absolutely fuck all. It did absolutely nothing. Amumu got nerfed, but the thing is, Amumu is still buffed because of the buff that happened before from patch 6.0. It went from, it went from an amount to an amount. And then basically the nerf just brought it in the middle. So it's still a buff from patch 6.0. So it went from patch 6.0 times 2 to patch 6.0a, and then times 1, you could say, to patch 6.0b. So Amumu is still buffed and still stronger than what he was before patch 6.0. So Amumu is still very powerful. Durability patch is still good. Tank items are still good. Amumu is still one of the best junglers out there. Incredible ultimate, very fast jungle clear speed still. Yes, your jungle clear speed got a little bit nerfed, but I don't think it's too bad. I don't think you want to play AP Amumu anymore. I think tank Amumu is definitely the way to go, with the ultimate ratio getting lowered with the AP ratio. Again, the same with Mbessa as well. Mbessa received some nerfs, but again, her kit in general is just way too powerful. Her mobility, her lockdown potential, her damage, her reset mechanic as well. Mbessa is just way too good. Way too good right now for just how Wild Rift works as a game and just how the champion benefits it so much. Echo as well, still a very strong AP jungler, probably one of the strongest AP junglers out there at the moment when you're playing these AP carries. As an assassin as well, also very good in that regard as well. S tier, nothing's really changed in the S tier. All these champions are still very good. Zed is still very good if you want to play an assassin, but all these bruisers are still very good. Vi, Riven, Jarvan, Hecarim, Xin Zhao, Shyvana, Wukong, Warwick, Olaf, all these bruisers are very powerful. Bruiser meta is very, very real right now in the meta, and it's very, very powerful. Lilia is still very good as well. Rammus is there as another tank if you want another tank option. If Mumu is banned, Rammus is also a very good option if you're against a lot of AD champions. And Talon received a bit of a buff. So Talon has moved up into A tier from B tier. Overall, Talon just works very well as a jungler because you can jump over walls, you can turn invisible, and you have a lot of great ganking potential. And the great thing is that the buff that he received buffed his late game. So it was more to do with the AD scaling, because Talon's early game was already very good. Like I said, his ganking potential was very good. His clear speed was still decent, but he was just lacking that late game damage as an assassin. So he's been moved up into A tier. I think I moved some other champions up as well. I think Kha'Zix has also been moved up from B to A tier. It's still a champion that can carry games and perform pretty well. I think that's all I moved up in A tier. Diana, I moved down from S tier to A tier. I thought that what's it called? Not rework, the bug fix would actually help Diana, but it didn't. The bug fix didn't help Diana at all. She still got hit really, really hard in patch 6.0 with the nerf. So again, A tier champions are still good. You can still make them work, but I think that, Echo and Zed are much better assassins to play right now in the jungle. And there are a lot of other better bruisers to play in the jungle right now as well. And Evelynn received a buff to her ultimate. She is still completely terrible. She still does 0 damage. She can't really do anything at all. The only plus side to Evelynn is that she's invisible. So you can try and surprise enemies, but to be honest, when you surprise enemies, you don't have the burst damage in your kit to be able to one-shot enemy champions. Yeah, that's my just thoughts overall. But yeah, other A tier champions that are very good to kind of shout out in a way. Obviously Mosti, very good in low elo still. You can still play likes of Pantheon. Morgana is doing pretty well at the moment. I think Morgana can be a pretty underrated jungler because of how fast her clear speed is and how easy and brain dead she is really to play, to be fair. You just hit your Q, put your second ability down, black shield yourself, whoopee, I do a bunch of damage now basically. And yeah, B tier champions are just champions that are either unique, like Neela, Fiora, Camille, Jace, some of these unique Baron lane champions that are not that strong in the jungle anymore, or champions like Maokai and Evelynn and these champions that are just not that strong at the moment. On to the mid lane. Nothing actually changed really in the mid lane. I've got 2 notes in the mid lane, and that's it. Ziggs, I've moved down from S tier to A tier. I think in general, Ziggs is one of the weaker mages right now. Not that his damage output is very weak, but it's more to do with what he brings to a team. If you think of other mages that other mages, what they bring to a team, Orianna has shielding, movement speed buff, this huge massive AoE ultimate that can bring everyone together. Ahri has a charm which can allow other enemies to follow up. Veigar has cage, Zoe has bubbles, Syndra has the stun, Victor has a bunch of burst damage and also the second ability to slow enemies. Ziggs just throws bombs and tries his best to do as much damage as possible, which it can work in some scenarios, but again, I feel like there are just other mages which bring more to team fights and more to a team comp that allows them to be stronger than Ziggs is at the moment. But again, Ziggs still sits in A tier, still a very strong champion to play. I still think Syndra and Victor are the 2 strongest. I would say Victor is probably the king of the mid lane right now. I would say Syndra is just behind him. If there was like a God tier, an S plus tier, and an S tier, I'd probably go like that, like Victor, Syndra, and then the rest. But both of these champions are very, very powerful. But I wouldn't look past some of these S tier champions in the mid lane as well. Yasuo, if you want to play full crit or even just tank Yasuo in the mid lane, can still perform very, very well. Zoe as a pick-off mage is still very good. Echo, one of the safest assassins to play in the mid. So much mobility, so much wave clear, and so much damage potential. And even A tier champions, as I mentioned, is really good. Some really big shout outs right now. Aurelion Sol is performing very, very well because we're moving more into a tank meta. Aurelion Sol does a lot of damage based on tanks, and also his build is more to do with a tank killer build. So overall, Aurelion Sol is doing very, very well right now. Kennen as well, with a lot of team fights happening in the game right now. Kennen is also performing pretty well. And that is pretty much it. Yeah, Akali in general, as I was mentioning before, the buff didn't really do anything, didn't really increase the damage or anything. You get more movement speed now with your second ability. Doesn't really do too much. Again, assassins in general still feel pretty weak and they're not really as strong. They can still perform well, but they need more resources in their kit to be able to perform to a high standard like other champions in the meta. And then B tier are still other champions that are pretty underperforming right now in the mid lane. Your more supportive mid laners, Irelia just does no damage right now. Pyke, Talon, Swain, and Lucian. AD carry. I moved some champions to S plus tier. I think I wouldn't say by far, but I would say two of the safest and best AD carries to pick right now in solo queue are Varus and Xayah. The reason I say that is, no, I'm not saying Xayah because she's my main. A lot of people have been saying this as well. Like, I've been talking to some support mains which are very high elo in EU, and they're saying when they play with a Xayah, they feel a lot stronger than with other ADCs. And in general, Xayah feels very powerful. And she is very powerful. You know, her damage output is great. Her lockdown is also great as well. So when your supports walk up and try and look for an engage, you can stun them afterwards with your feathers. But one of the great reasons why Xayah is so great is because of her self-pill potential. She can kind of be by herself against some of these bruisers and some of these assassins, and she'll be able to buy time with the likes of her ultimate, her feathers, do a bunch of burst damage, and still come out of a fight untouched. It's really, really great how much self-pill Xayah has, and how great she is with so many different supports. You can play enchanters with Xayah to buff her damage. You could play engage supports to help with her feathers, and again, just help with her damage. Just overall, very good AD carry. And Varus as well. I think the reason why Varus is up here is just because of the flexibility of Varus. There are so many different ways to play Varus, whether you want to play this phase rush build with items like Essence Reaver, Rift Maker, Trinity Force, and going more of the AP route, building items like Crown of Shatter Queen, and Infinity Orb as your last items. Or you can go for an AD build like this Lethality build with First Strike, focusing more on poke damage. Or you can even go on here. On here is not bad. It's probably the worst of the three builds for Varus, but there are some scenarios, if you're with like a Lulu or someone like that, where on here Varus can be very, very powerful. Behind it in the S tier, we still have the same champions in the S tier that have not really changed too much. All these champions have different benefits and can still perform very, very well. Of course, shout outs to likes of Vayne right now, who is very, very powerful in this tank-like meta. Lucian can still work with very aggressive supports like Nami and other tank supports. Severe in general is a bit of a weird one. Her laning phase just feels very AFK. You're just pushing the lane time and time again. But what Severe brings to a team fight with her ultimate is just very, very powerful compared to other AD carries. But I think you rely a lot more on your team rather than yourself to carry. His Fortune, obviously, of course, very strong as well. You can go Conqueror or First Strike. Both work very well. And Zeri is also very powerful. In the A tier, Jinx has moved up from B tier to A tier. I don't think Jinx is powerful enough to warrant moving her into S tier. I still think she relies a bit too much on enchanter supports. I think the buffs were pretty nice. I think reducing the mana cost on the rockets is very nice, and also increase the damage is pretty good. It means that the laning phase, you can now poke a little bit more and you could do more damage during the laning phase, and you'll also be able to do a lot more when it comes to the mid to late game in terms of damage. Again, I just still feel like she struggles a lot against some of these bruisers and also tanks, because she doesn't have any escape. She doesn't have any way to escape or any peeling at all. So she relies on enchanter supports, but honestly, she might be one of the best AD carries with enchanter supports right now. Other champions in the A tier are still performing pretty decently. B tier, I've moved Draven down from A tier to B tier. The problem with the durability patch with Draven is that he hasn't been able to spike as much. It's very easy at the moment in the dual lane to just stay on the tower, play safe, wait for your jungler to gank, kill the Draven, and then Draven's already put behind. And when you're behind with Draven, you're probably the worst champion in the game. You have to get ahead. You have to get an early game lead. You have to play aggressive and try and get some kills with your passive. If you don't get any kills, then you're kind of useless. And again, as I mentioned, because of the durability patch, everyone's more tankier, so it's a bit more difficult for Draven to take these kills. Other champions in the B tier as well. And then Kalista, even though she did receive a buff, the buff basically did nothing at all. She does a bit more damage in the 2 versus 2, but overall her damage output is just, yeah, terrible still. Not that good. And support. I'm still struggling to think of who is the best support out there at the moment. Who are the S+ tier supports? I think there are so many different supports, so many good supports for so many different scenarios. You know, if I just quickly go through these S tier champions, Lux as a carry support is one of the best with her lockdown and burst damage. Ornn for team fights with his knock up and also during laning phase is great as a tank, you know, with Nautilus and Leona also being there. If you need an enchanter support to buff some of your hyper carries, Lulu's still very powerful, Janna for appealing, Soraka, even though she did receive a bit of a nerf, is also still very powerful, and Milio for the extra auto attack range. If you're against any of these enchanters, then you pick Blitzcrank, because Blitzcrank can just hook some of these enchanters. You do a bunch of base damage, you do some crazy crowd control, and also the movement speed buff is very, very good. And Yordle Trap is a great item to try and snowball games when against these enchanters. Singed is a bit more of a unique pick, but a great playmaking champion that can carry games. And Pyke as well in the support role is a great carry option as well. So there's so many different scenarios and so many different picks for these support sites. In my opinion, very difficult to try and pick out who is the best support right now, who is the S+ tier, who is a champion that I think should be picked above the rest. Because if you think of these, you know, think of the other S+ tier, Jax, Wukong, and Ornn, I would pick in every scenario. Jungle, Ambessa, Amumu, Echo, I would always pick one of these three. Syndra, Victor, I would always pick one of these two. Dual lane, Varus and Xayah, I'd always pick this too. I can't think of a support pick that I'm like, yes, I want to pick this support in every single game. It completely depends on your team comp, the enemy team comp, and it's a good thing though. It's a good thing that there are not, I guess, no OP supports out there, but there are a lot of very, very strong supports. Honestly, there's a world that all of these can move up into S+ tier and everyone can just move up a tier, but I'm not going to do that. That's just really weird. A-tier champions, Yuumi is still not great. She's still good in the right scenarios, but still not great. Thresh, in my opinion, is the worst of the tank supports with the likes of Galio. Then you have some engage supports and some damage supports. I did move Zyra down because I don't think Zyra is as good as some of these other champions in S tier. I was flicking through these S tier champions and I was like, who is the weakest out of these that maybe deserve to move down? And Zyra was the one to move down. Senna's also moved down from A tier to B tier. Just overall, Senna's very, like, struggling a lot with item builds, with runes, with how to play her, and overall she's having a really big identity crisis right now, which is why she's sitting in the B tier. But that's everything overall. I just wanted to give you a quick rundown on the patch notes and of what has changed in my tier list. I will also be doing a rune tier list rundown very, very soon, talking about all the runes, and also an item tier list rundown, talking about all the items. And even though these two tier lists are very vague and they're very up in the air because every rune and every item is very situational, there are definitely some runes and items up there that are just way above the rest. And I think it's a good time for us to sit down, give a recap of where we're looking at in terms of the meta and runes, items, etc. So I'll probably do another video in the near future, because the last one I did was on patch 5.3. So I'll probably do a video in the near future trying to do one of these. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed the tier list rundown. Thank you all for tuning in. As always, if you enjoyed the content on this channel, make sure you leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.